The dust hung thick in the air as Maria stumbled through the canyon, her breath coming in ragged gasps. 3 days she'd been running now, 3 days since she'd escaped from the reservation, where the soldiers had tried to hold her people like cattle. Her feet were raw and bleeding, wrapped in strips torn from her buckskin dress, and hunger gnawed at her belly like a living thing. She could hear them behind her, distant but persistent. The cavalry didn't give up easy, especially not when one of their prisoners slipped away in the night. But Maria had learned to move like smoke through these mountains, taught by her grandmother before the soldiers came, before everything changed. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, she spotted a ranch house nestled in a small valley below. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth and, perhaps, food. It was dangerous approaching a white man's home, but she had no choice. Her strength was failing, and if she didn't find shelter soon, the desert would claim her before the soldiers ever could. The rancher was mending fence posts when she emerged from the scrub brush like an apparition. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30 years old, with sun-weathered skin and careful eyes. His hand moved instinctively toward the rifle leaning against the fence, but he didn't grab it. Instead, he studied her, taking in her torn clothing, her exhausted stance, the desperate pride still burning in her dark eyes. "Please," Maria said in halting English, the word foreign on her tongue. "Help." For a long moment, he said nothing. She could see him weighing the consequences, understanding immediately what she was, where she'd come from. The cavalry had been through these parts just yesterday, asking questions, showing wanted notices. But something in her face must have moved him, because he finally nodded slowly. "Come inside," he said, quickly, before anyone sees. His name was Thomas McCready, and he'd inherited this small ranch from his father 2 years ago. He lived alone, he explained as he set a plate of beans and cornbread before her, his wife having died of fever the previous winter. There was a sadness in his voice when he spoke of her, a loneliness that Maria recognized in herself. She ate slowly, forcing herself not to devour the food, though every fiber of her being screamed for her to fill the aching void in her stomach. Between bites, she told him her story, the words coming easier now. How the soldiers had rounded up her band, forcing them onto land that wasn't theirs, land that couldn't sustain them. How the children cried from hunger, how the old ones died one by one from despair as much as disease. How she'd waited for the right moment and then ran, knowing she might die, but unable to live another day in captivity. Thomas listened without interruption, his blue eyes serious. When she finished, he pushed back from the table and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening landscape. "They'll come looking," he said finally. "They always do." "I know. I will leave before dawn." He turned back to her, and something in his expression had changed. "Where will you go? You're half dead already. Another 3 days in the desert, and you won't make it to wherever you're headed." Maria lifted her chin. "Then I will die free. Or," Thomas said slowly, "you could stay, at least until you're strong enough to have a real chance." She stared at him, searching for the trap, the trick. White men didn't help Apache women, not without a price. But his face held only a quiet determination, and that same loneliness she'd glimpsed before. "Why?" she asked simply. He was quiet for a long time. "My wife, before she died, she made me promise something. She said I shouldn't let grief turn me into stone, that I should remember there's still goodness to be done in this world." Maybe this is what she meant. That night, he gave her his bed, insisting despite her protests. He took blankets to the barn, promising to keep watch in case the cavalry came searching. Maria lay in the unfamiliar softness, her body aching but finally warm, finally safe. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry. The soldiers came 2 days later, Maria heard their horses before Thomas did, and she scrambled from where she'd been helping him in the garden, ready to run. But Thomas grabbed her arm. "The cellar," he said urgently. "There's a space behind the preserves. Get in there and don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." She wanted to argue, to tell him not to risk himself, but there was no time. She slipped into the small house and down through the trap door, wedging herself into the narrow space he'd described. Above, she heard the cavalry arrive, heard their captain's voice demanding to know if Thomas had seen a fugitive Apache woman. "Can't say I have," Thomas replied, his voice calm and steady. "Been pretty quiet out here. Mind if we search your property? Be my guest, but I'm telling you there's nothing to find." For 20 agonizing minutes, Maria listened to boots stomping through the house, through the barn, heard them moving things, opening doors. One soldier, though, even came down to the cellar, and she held her breath until her lungs burned, pressed back into the shadows. But he didn't see her there, behind the rows of preserved vegetables. And finally, they left. Thomas waited a full hour before opening the cellar and calling her up. When she emerged, she found him sitting at the table, his hands shaking slightly. "You lied for me," she said, stunned. "If they discover this, they will hang you." "Then I guess we better make sure they don't discover it," he replied with a crooked smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Days turned into weeks. Maria regained her strength, helping Thomas with the ranch work. She knew the land in ways he never could, showing him where water ran beneath the surface, which plants could sustain livestock through drought, how to read the weather and the behavior of birds and the smell of the wind. In turn, he taught her more English, shared his books with her, treated her not as a fugitive or a savage, but as a person, as an equal. They didn't speak of the future. It hung between them, unacknowledged, that strange and fragile thing growing in the silence of shared meals and long days working side by side under the endless sky. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Maria finally broke the silence. "Thomas, there is something I must tell you." He turned to her, concern immediate in his eyes. "What is it?" She placed a hand on her belly, her voice steady though her heart raced. "I am with child. When the soldiers had me at the reservation, there was a man, one of my people. Before I escaped, before everything fell apart. He died there from the sickness that took so many. But his child lives in me." She watched his face carefully, waiting for the rejection, the anger, the disgust. Instead, after a long moment, Thomas simply nodded. "How far along?" 3 months, perhaps 4. I was not certain until recently." He was quiet, staring out at the horizon where the last light was fading. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "A child. There hasn't been a child in this house since I was born here myself." "I understand if you want me to leave," Maria said, though the words hurt to speak. "You have already risked so much." "Leave?" Thomas turned to her, and in his eyes she saw not rejection, but something else entirely, something that made her breath catch. "Maria, I don't want you to leave. I haven't wanted that for weeks now. I just didn't know how to say it." He took a breath. "When you came here, half dead and desperate, you reminded me that life goes on, that there's still something worth fighting for in this hard world. And now you're telling me there's going to be a baby." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, carefully, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. "Stay," he said, "both of you. Let me help you raise this child. Let me give you both a home. The soldiers, let me worry about the soldiers. We'll say you're my wife, that you came from back east after my first wife died. Your English is good enough now to pass. We'll make up a story, create papers if we need to. This ranch is remote enough that most people don't ask too many questions. You would do this? Maria whispered. You would claim another man's child as your own. That child is going to need a father, Thomas said simply. And I find that I very much want to be that father, if you'll let me. If you'll stay. Maria thought of her grandmother, of the stories she'd told about Coyote and Crow, about how the world was always changing, always surprising, how survival sometimes meant adapting in ways you never expected. She thought of the child growing inside her, the child who would need protection, love, a chance at life. She thought of this quiet man who had risked everything for a stranger, who looked at her not with pity or possession, but with respect and something deeper, something that had been growing between them like grass pushing up through hard-packed earth. I will stay, she said finally. We will stay. But Thomas, this will not be easy. There will be questions, suspicions. My people and yours, they do not mix easily. No, he agreed. It won't be easy. But the things worth doing rarely are. As night settled fully over the ranch, Maria allowed herself, for the first time since the soldiers came, to imagine a future. Not the future she'd planned, not the life she'd expected, but something new. A child who would grow up knowing both worlds, a home built not on what was owed or expected, but on choice and courage. A partnership forged in desperation, but sustained by something far stronger. We're going to have babies, she said softly, using the plural because somehow she knew this wouldn't be the only child, that this strange new family they were creating would grow and persist despite everything against it. Thomas smiled, a real smile this time, and squeezed her hand. Yes, he said. I suppose we are. Above them, stars emerged one by one, the same stars that had guided Maria through her desperate flight, now witnesses to this unexpected refuge she'd found. The night was cool, but not cold, and from somewhere in the darkness came the cry of a coyote, wild and free and full of impossible survival. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There would be more close calls, more lies to maintain, more moments of fear that discovery would tear apart what they were building. But tonight, sitting on the porch of the ranch house, a fugitive woman and a lonely rancher had found something neither had been looking for, something neither had dared hope for in this harsh and unforgiving land. They had found each other, and that would have to be enough.